We are going to cover Chapter 13, Civil War, 1861 through 1865. So we're just going to hit the highlights of the Civil War. I've added some other videos from Crash Course that give you like a rundown of the battles and then some also military strategy that we're not going to get too involved in this video. Just highlights from the chapter. In this video, let's see, we've got in this chapter, the sections that we're going to cover are The Nation Goes to War, Military Conflict and Political Strife from 1861 through 1862, The War Transforms the North and the South, and The Tide of War Turns, 1863 through 1865. So the first part we're going to talk about is The Nation Goes to War, 1861. So the South is going to embrace secession, and we talked very briefly at the end of Chapter 12 about the first state that decided to leave the Union, and that was the state of South Carolina. And from there we have 6 more that followed suit. So we have the South embracing secession. We have Confederate leaders justified leaving that secession around the issue of slavery, arguing that the North had not fully upheld the Fugitive Slave Act or the Dred Scott decision, and that Republicans in power would not safeguard Southern interest and might inspire slave uprisings. So after his inauguration, Lincoln attempted to find a way to restore the Union, but he also wanted to demonstrate Union strength and focus on resupplying Fort Sumter in South Carolina. It's important to know where Fort Sumter is. It's in South Carolina. In response to the planned resupply mission, the Confederates launched an attack on the fort. After Fort Sumter's surrender, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to defeat the insurrection. Although some small farmers and landless whites in the Upper South were suspicious of the motives of secessionist planters, most Southerners supported secession as a way to maintain white supremacy and power as promoted by wealthy white Southern planters. Lincoln took steps to keep border states that allowed slavery in the Union. But we do see 4 more slave states secede, including Virginia, and the Confederates moved their capital to Richmond, Virginia, due to the state's importance as the home of the South's largest iron manufacturer and its proximity to the U.S. Capitol. In just a minute, we'll look at a map, and I'll show you, if you don't know how close Richmond, Virginia is to Washington, D.C., you're going to be surprised at the proximity and the very strategic move that the South makes moving their capital to Richmond, Virginia. Although the initial secessions increased anxiety in the North over economic issues, the attack of Fort Sumter rallied most Northerners who believed the war would be over in months. So both sides are going to begin preparing for war. The Union held some significant advantages over the Confederacy at the start of the war, including a larger population, higher levels of manufacturing and agricultural production, and more miles of railroad track over which to move troops and supplies. Building of Northern troops proved a challenge in terms of the numbers and preparedness of volunteers. Lincoln's reliance on state militias as opposed to a strong federal army left Union troops disorganized and without strong military leadership. Kind of sounds really close to what was happening during the Revolution, doesn't it? Confederate troops held distinctive advantages at the start. More volunteers with longer terms of enlistment, the use of slave labor, which freed up white men to volunteer for the military, the fact that the war would largely be fought on their home territory, so they're defending their home territory, and experienced military leadership, including close to 300 West Point graduates. The first major battle of the war at Bull Run in July of 1861 was a Confederate victory that demonstrated the South's advantages. The South did not follow up its victories in the summer of 1861 with major strikes against Union troops. The Union blockade of Southern ports began, and both sides settled in for a war that would be longer than either side had anticipated. So just to give you a visual here, you can see North population versus South population. So North is at the bottom, South is at the top. So North, 61% of the population compared to 39%. The railroad mileage, a lot more railroads throughout the North than in the South. Also, we don't really think about farm acreage, but as far as agricultural production, because think about this, in the South, what are we primarily growing? we're primarily growing cotton. We're not really growing food in our crops. So farm acreage, yes, there is more farm acreage in the north, but also they're utilizing that farm acreage to actually grow food. Commodity output, 70% compared to 30% in the South. And then, of course, all the factories, because what we're reinvesting money in, we're not investing it in industry and factories, we're investing it in slaves. So more factories, 85% of the factories are located in the North as opposed to only 15% in the South. So military conflict and political strife, 1861 to 1862. So let's talk about wartime roles of African Americans and also the native population Indians. African Americans in the North connected Union victory with emancipation, freeing of slaves, but they were initially blocked from serving in the Union Army. Although abolitionists joined African Americans in connecting the war with emancipation, Lincoln and other white leaders saw the war as a means to preserve the Union. This belief, combined with the conviction that the war would be short, contributed to the rejection of black soldiers. Southern slaves took advantage of the war to run away, and some slaves offered Union troops their knowledge of the land and of Confederate troops' locations. Under General Benjamin Butler, he's a Union general, and he claimed fugitive slaves as contraband of war and offered them military protection. His decision resulted in more slaves running away. Congress furthered Butler's policy by passing a Confiscation Act. The legislation was enacted in an effort to weaken the Confederacy, but it also provided hope to abolitionists. The Confederacy gained the support of some slave-holding Indians, but the majority of tribes sided with the Union. The Confederacy's Indian allies played a critical role in many of the early battles. Cherokee and Seminole warriors contributed to the Confederate victory at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Union sentiment regarding the war's purpose began to turn in the face of numerous defeats, and more Northerners connected the war with ending slavery. Congress passed a series of acts that reflected this change, including one that allowed African Americans to enlist. As white Union troops confronted the realities of slavery during their fighting in the South, they became more opposed to slavery. That's a test question. The steady increase in the war's casualties meant that the Union would need more recruits to sustain the fight, which also helped to persuade Northerners to support African American enlistment. By 1863, tens of thousands of African American troops, including the Massachusetts 54th Colored Infantry, were contributing to Northern victories. Here are some depictions of the early battles of the Civil War. And I want to just point out really quickly, here's our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Here's the southern capital, Richmond, Virginia. Notice how close they are, and that was on purpose. Excuse me. Let me point it out for you. Washington, D.C. is here. Richmond, Virginia is here. See the close proximity? That was intentional. Well, what about Union politicians? What are they doing? What strategies are they using to try to hurry up and end the war? So support for making emancipation a goal of the war, that's going to increase during the year of 1862. But Lincoln, he really worried that imposing emancipation might drive more Southerners from the Union. Remember, we have 4 border states. Kentucky, Maryland, 2 more. Those are all slave-owning states that are still part of the Union. Though it would also likely prevent internal recognition of Southern independence, it would likely prevent international recognition of Southern independence if this emancipation law was passed. The Confederacy realized the importance of European recognition as an independent nation, and so that put pressure on the Union to accept Southern independence and keep economic markets open for the South. Abolitionist lectures toured Britain to increase support for the Union and put pressure on Lincoln to formalize emancipation. But Lincoln, he wanted a Union battle victory first so that a proclamation of emancipation would be a demonstration of Union strength rather than like the sign of weakness. So Lincoln announced a preliminary emancipation proclamation to his cabinet after Union declared victory in the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. Lincoln then signs the final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863, It applied only to slaves in rebel states. However, and it cited military, not moral reasons for abolition. So two things there that are really important. It doesn't apply to every slave-holding state. So those 4 border states, they could still have slaves. It does not emancipate any slaves in those 4 states. And technically, it does not emancipate a single slave in those rebellious states because their white masters ain't going to tell them that they're free. So it doesn't really do anything, but it's a military strategic move, as pointed out in the actual proclamation. It's not a moral reason, it's a military reason for emancipating slaves. The limits of the proclamation, it did not dampen celebrations among abolitionists and Africans, though. Like, they're still excited that this is happening, although it doesn't apply to every slaveholding state. It applies to those in rebellion. This is a portrait of Lincoln presenting the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. And it's kind of interesting because the gentlemen sitting like on this side compared to those on this side are for and against the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation. So we're going to now talk about how war is transforming the North and the South. And we're first going to talk about life and death on the battlefield. So soldiers in battle, they witness mass carnage due to improved weaponry, and any romantic notions of warfare, they're quickly erased. Soldiers on both sides suffered from supply shortages, including a lack of shoes. A lot of soldiers are running into battle without shoes on. They don't have proper rations. Union soldiers, they do see an improvement in their supplies over the course of the war, but Confederate soldiers, they face worsening conditions as the war continues. Diseases killed 3 times the number of soldiers who were felled in actual military combat. Black soldiers died from disease in significantly higher numbers than their white counterparts because they don't have an immune system built up like whites do, and also their diets were so poor, they didn't have as much strength as their white counterparts did. Although the U.S. Sanitary Commission improved medical care and filled hospital conditions for Union soldiers, medical assistance was generally quite primitive. The high casualty rates from combat and disease led to the use of mass graves on both sides. The horrors of war that's going to lead to an increased rate of desertion and a decrease in volunteers, forcing both sides to implement the draft. The North's economic advantages only increased as the conflict continued. While the war initially hurt the Northern economy due to the loss of Southern cotton and Southern markets, by 1863 the North had rebounded and its economy was flourishing due to the manufacture of wartime products, such as weapons, ammunition, blankets, clothing, shoes, and battleships. The federal government expanded its activities during the war, providing increased protection for industries and hiring women for the war effort. The Union nationalized its currency and the banking system. The federal budget grew from $63 million in 1860 to $1.3 billion by 1865, and the federal government became the nation's largest employer during the war. The increased demand for northern industrial goods was complicated by a dwindling labor force due to the war. Manufacturers responded by mechanizing more tasks, hiring more native-born women and children, and promoting European immigration to the United States. What does it do to the South? Well, it increased urbanization and industrialization in the South. The needs of the military required an increase in Southern industrial output, which resulted in urban growth as laborers moved to the cities for jobs in new factories. Let's talk about women. So Union and Confederate women supported the war effort in a variety of ways. Some served as nurses, some served as spies or couriers, some were soldiers. Others took jobs in the private and public sectors that had been vacated by men serving in the military, and many women organized relief efforts and raised money for supplies for soldiers. Southern women helped in the field of medical care, but unlike Northern women, they had no government-sanctioned body coordinating their efforts, which limited their effectiveness in organization. Women like Rose O'Neal Greenhow and Harriet Tubman served as spies. Women also served as couriers, and some even disguised themselves as men to fight in the war. Abolitionist women increased their efforts, resulting in the creation of the Women's National Loyal League and a petition to extend Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation to the rest of the nation. This is Dr. Mary E. Walker. She's one of I believe she is the first female doctor. And that was out of necessity. We needed more people to serve in the medical field because all the men that were serving the medical field, they were needed to fight in the battles and to fight on the front lines. So more women are stepping into those roles of nurses, and Dr. Walker's instance, stepping in as actual trained doctors. But not everything is going, towards the war effort. We are going to have some dissent, some people that disagree with the war effort, and also some protests that happen in the midst of the war. The length of the war, the rising casualty rates, and the negative impact of the war on wages and prices spurred Northern opposition to the war. In Missouri, a slave state that had remained in the Union, a border state, Confederate sympathizers formed militias and attacked Union supporters. Thousands were killed in these raids, causing the Union to station troops in the area. An increasing number of Northerners began turning against the war in 1863. In some cases, these individuals had always opposed emancipation. However, discontent rose among working-class Northerners as it became clear that the economic gains of the war primarily benefited factory owners and industrialists. Then we have the Enrollment Act of 1863 that emphasized the inequities of the war as it provided a loophole for wealthier citizens to buy their way out of military service. White workers also feared job competition when considering emancipation. Riots erupted across cities in the North in response to the draft and to rising inflation, and those protests targeted African Americans, Republican draft officials, Protestant missionaries, and wealthy businessmen. An increasing number of Northern Democrats, called Copperheads by their opponents, stood against the war effort, gaining electoral victories in areas where opposition to the war was higher. This is an image of the New York City raft riots. This is in July of 1863. I believe this is them attacking a black orphanage and burning it to the ground. Luckily, all of the children and the people working were able to get out before it completely caught on fire and burned down. But a lot of this angst and anger over the war is taken out on the African American population, and this is including in the North too. Dissent grew in the South as well. The Confederate draft garnered widespread opposition because it undermined states' rights and because it highlighted class inequalities. Since large slaveholders were exempt from military service, just like in the North, if you were wealthy, you could pay your way out of the draft. Food shortages plagued the South as the war continued and the Union gained control of the major food production centers of the Confederacy. The Confederate Army's forced acquisition of farm produce intensified shortages for many Southerners. Food shortages and intense inflation led to food riots, often led by women in cities across the South. These problems, as well as the devastating impact the war had on small farmers' lands, resulted in increased opposition to the war in the South. The war's opponents attempted to secure peace with the Union and actively tried to impede Confederate military success. The war increased the gulf between wealthy planters and poor Southerners. Internal dissent contributed to Southern defeat by weakening soldiers' commitment to fighting during the final 2 years of the war. But then the tide of war begins to turn, and we have some key victories for the Union. Confederate victories at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville convinced General Lee to invade the North. The new Union commander, General George A. Meade, faced Lee at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This 3-day battle in early July of 1863 saw high casualty rates, heightened by a disastrous Confederate assault led by General George Pickett on Union lines. Ultimately, the Union claimed victory at Gettysburg. The Union's victory at Gettysburg was rapidly followed by a major victory for the North at Vicksburg, Mississippi. This success, engineered by General Ulysses S. Grant, and the Union Army's subsequent victory at Port Hudson, Louisiana, gave the North control of the entire Mississippi Valley and effectively cut off Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas from the rest of the Confederacy. The Union's war of attrition eroded Confederate support for the war throughout 1864. Union victories increased support for Lincoln and his party, and Republicans openly supported the abolitionist goal of the war in the lead-up to the 1864 elections. Northern Democrats chose as their presidential nominee the former Union commander, George B. McClellan, who campaigned on a platform to end the war and readmit Confederate states with slavery intact. Union General William T. Sherman's capture of Atlanta secured Republican victory in the election. However, it does give Republicans a mandate to continue the war to its conclusion. So these are the ones we just talked about. The infamous Battle of Gettysburg here in Pennsylvania. And then the Vicksburg campaign in Mississippi. While Lincoln's re-election ensured the end of slavery, the President and Congress could not have secured emancipation without the success and contributions of African American soldiers who openly fought in the war with the aim of ending slavery everywhere. Slaves in border states into which the Emancipation Proclamation did not extend rushed to enlist in the Union Army since black soldiers were guaranteed and granted freedom. By the end of the war, some 37,000 African Americans had died fighting for their freedom and the Union. Black soldiers had to contend with racism in the military as demonstrated by segregation in camps, the menial jobs given to blacks, and wage discrepancies between black and white soldiers. Following African American protests, the War Department equalized pay in June of 1864. As the war continued, more Southern slaves fled to Union lines to gain their freedom. We're coming down to the final battles of a hard war. In March of 1864, Lincoln made Grant commander of the entire Union Army, and he employed a strategy of total war. The Confederate Army won victories in May and June of 1864, but the high casualty rate suffered by the Confederates in these battles eroded any gains for the South. Although criticized as a butcher, Grant continued his strategy of laying siege to the civilian and military populations of the Confederacy. Sherman's victory at Atlanta in the fall of 1864 cut the South in half. Sherman's march to the sea in the fall of 1864 devastated the landscape, and slaves fled their plantations to join the Union troops. Many of the slaves were rejected, however, and some were abused by Union soldiers. African American ministers met with Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton in Savannah and argued that if former slaves were given their own land, they could maintain their freedom. Sherman responded by issuing Field Order No. 15, which allocated 400,000 acres of Confederate land to former slaves. American Indians were also disappointed by their treatment by the Union. Although many had been loyal allies during the war, their hope of being rewarded disappeared in 1864 as tens of thousands of whites migrated west of the Mississippi. Congress codified this migration with the passage of the Homestead Act in 1864. The increase in white migration led to more conflicts between Indians and the U.S. government. Several tribes went to war with the United States between 1862 and 1864 to defend broken treaties. Ultimately, Indians were not successful. They suffered numerous casualties, and they were often forced off their lands. Many U.S. Army officers considered victories in the West to be one means of unification once the Civil War came to an end. In January 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the nation, and ratification by the states was imminent as the war had changed the attitudes of many toward slavery. Some states and cities had already passed laws granting more rights to blacks, so at the end of the war, it really gave Northerners hope that a reunited nation would be a more just union. In the early months of 1865, the Confederacy began recruiting slaves into its army, promising them their freedom as payment. So it kind of sounds like they know they might be losing? I don't know. This motion passed in the Confederate House but failed in the Senate. Although this wouldn't have been enough to counter the Southern losses, it suggested that the Southern society had been transformed. In April of 1865, following Grant's capture of Richmond, Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, effectively ending the war. Northerners were optimistic that Lee's surrender signaled the reunited nation would be stronger than ever. Unfortunately, this hope was shattered when Abraham Lincoln was shot on April 14th by a Confederate fanatic. In the wake of Lincoln's death, the nation remained anxious and uncertain about the peace to come. And just take a minute to just kind of take in what's going. This is the capital of the Confederacy. So this is Richmond in ruins of April 1865. So pretty much just decimated the southern capital. You can see here It's all torn down, but look at this one gentleman sitting here. This is a black gentleman, probably uncertain about his future, just as the South is uncertain about their future as well now that the war is over. So as we move into chapter 14, we're going to talk about the South's future. We're going to talk about emancipation. We'll go back a little bit, and we're going to talk about what emancipation looked like. We're going to talk about Reconstruction and presidential Reconstruction, and then moving to Congressional Reconstruction.